Sweat dripped from David's chin, landing with a faint smack on the mahogany desk. It wasn't the ruined hard drive that made his chest tighten, nor the 50-story drop visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. It was the high-resolution image, glowing on the monitor, his billionaire boss completely exposed. Before he could kill the screen, the heavy oak door clicked shut, locking from the inside. She didn't call security. She just leaned against the frame, eyes dark, and whispered, "Do you think I'm pretty?" Fluorescent lights in the basement IT department always buzzed with a specific brain-scraping frequency. It sounded like an angry hornet trapped inside a tin can. David rubbed the bridge of his nose, pulling his glasses off to wipe the smudges on the hem of his flannel shirt. It was Tuesday. Tuesday meant meatloaf night for his 7-year-old Sam, provided David could leave by 6, catch the Red Line train, and not fall asleep, standing up, holding on to the metal overhead bar. He smelled like stale Folgers and the ozone emitted by racks of overheating servers. He liked it down here. It was safe. Machines made sense. They broke, you replaced a part. They corrupted, you restored a backup. They didn't ask for alimony. They didn't cry when their shoes were too tight, and they didn't judge the frayed cuffs of his jacket. The intercom on his desk cracked, a sharp burst of static, then the voice of Margaret, the executive assistant, whose vocal cords seemed permanently dipped in liquid nitrogen. "David, level 82. Now." David stared at the speaker. "Put a ticket in, Margaret. I've got 3 dead motherboards in accounting." "It's Harrington's personal terminal," Margaret replied. The line went dead. David sighed, the sound catching in his chest. Clara Harrington. CEO, founder, majority shareholder, and a woman who routinely laid off entire departments before her morning matcha. She was 32, a billionaire on paper and in practice, and possessed a reputation so cold it was a running joke that the HVAC systems on the top floor were just her breathing. He grabbed his tool bag, a canvas tote stained with thermal paste and coffee, and walked to the private elevator. The ride up was always physically uncomfortable. The sheer speed of the cab made his ears pop twice, the air pressure shifting violently as he was rocketed away from the subterranean grime and into the stratosphere of corporate wealth. The doors slid open with a soft, expensive ping. The 82nd floor didn't smell like ozone. It smelled like cedarwood, faint citrus, and money. The carpet was thick enough to swallow a dropped coin. The lighting was indirect, soft, casting no harsh shadows. David walked past Margaret's empty desk, his boots feeling overly loud, clumsy, like a stray dog wandering into a cathedral. The door to Harrington's office was a massive slab of frosted glass. He knocked once. No answer. He pushed it open. The room was vast, dominated by floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking a grey, rain-slicked city. The rain lashed against the thick glass, a muted, rhythmic thumping that somehow made the room feel even quieter. Clara Harrington sat behind a desk that looked like a single raw piece of petrified wood. She wasn't looking at him. She was staring out the window, a tumbler of amber liquid in one hand, the other resting flat on the desk. She wore a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than David's car. Her hair, usually pulled into an immaculate, terrifying knot, was down, falling around her shoulders in a loose, exhausted wave. "It's dead," she said. Her voice was lower than he expected, slightly raspy. "The computer?" David asked, stepping further into the room. He felt intensely aware of his own scent, the cheap deodorant, the damp wool of his coat from the morning commute. "It won't boot. It just spins. I need a file off the local drive. Now." She finally turned to look at him. Her eyes were bloodshot. The flawless magazine cover exterior was cracking. Just a hairline fracture, but David saw it. A smudge of mascara under her left eye. a slight tremor in the hand holding the glass. "I can pull the drive, put it in an enclosure, and run a recovery," David said, setting his bag on the floor. "Usually takes an hour." "Do it here," she commanded, taking a sip of her drink. "Don't take the drive out of this room." David frowned. Protocol dictated he take hardware down to the bench, but you didn't argue with the woman who signed the checks, especially when you were 2 months behind on rent and your kid needed braces. "Sure, I'll need to boot from a live USB." He moved behind the desk. She didn't stand up. She just swiveled her chair slightly, forcing David to squeeze past her. As he brushed by, he caught her scent. Not the sterile, corporate smell of the lobby. It was heavy, musky sandalwood, and something sharp like a crushed flower. He knelt beneath the desk, the thick carpet pressing into his knees. He unscrewed the side panel of the tower, the metal cold against his calloused fingertips. He could hear her breathing above him. Slow, measured, but just a little too tight. "Is the file in your standard user directory?" David asked, plugging his diagnostic drive into a USB header on the motherboard. "It's in a hidden folder on the desktop," she said. "Password protected. I'll enter the key when you mount it." David pressed the power button. The fan spun up a low whine, cutting through the silence of the office. He watched the BIOS screen flash, his fingers flying across his portable keyboard to force the boot sequence. He was in his element now. The anxiety of her presence faded, slightly replaced by the familiar logic of code and directories. He had no idea what was waiting for him in the silicon. The Linux recovery environment booted, throwing a stark, utilitarian white terminal onto the massive curved monitor on Harrington's desk. David stood back up, joints popping. He hovered near her shoulder, trying to maintain a professional distance, but the geometry of the desk forced him close. "Drive is mounted," David said, his voice dropping a register, instinctively trying to match the quiet of the room. "The file system is corrupted, but the partition table is intact. I'm running a quick index. It'll rebuild the desktop directory tree in a second." Clara didn't say anything. She just watched the lines of code cascading down the screen. The ice clinked in her glass. "Okay," David breathed, typing a final command. Graphical interface coming up. The screen flickered. The cold terminal vanished, replaced by a visual representation of her corrupted hard drive. Folders appeared, grayed out, then slowly filled with color as the recovery tool bypassed the broken registry. "Navigate to the desktop," she said, her voice completely devoid of emotion. David clicked his mouse. A folder named archive_temp sat alone in the center of the screen. It was locked. "I need you to type the password," David said, stepping back to give her room. She didn't move. She just stared at the folder. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was the rain hammering the glass behind them. "Type it for me," she finally said. David hesitated. "I don't know the password, Ms. Harrington." "It's Icarus." David raised an eyebrow but kept his mouth shut. He leaned over his forearm, brushing the silk of her sleeve. A jolt of static electricity snapped between them. She flinched just barely, but didn't pull away. David typed the letters. ICARUS. He hit enter. The progress bar hung for a second. The drive clicked audibly beneath the desk. A sharp mechanical scratching sound. Come on, David thought. Don't die now. The folder opened. The recovery software, attempting to reconstruct the data as efficiently as possible, immediately began generating thumbnails for the files inside. It was a standard feature, something David had seen 1,000,000 times. It bypassed file names to render the raw image data to ensure it wasn't corrupted. A grid of 6 squares popped onto the screen. David froze. His hand, still resting on the mouse, went entirely rigid. The breath died in his throat. They weren't financial documents. They weren't offshore bank accounts or blueprints or hostile takeover plans. They were photographs, high-resolution, raw, unedited photographs. And they were of her. The first thumbnail showed her sitting on the edge of a bed, the lighting harsh and unapologetic. She was completely bare. But it wasn't a glamorous shot. It wasn't intended for a magazine or a lover. She was hunched over her arms, wrapped around her knees, staring at the camera with an expression of profound, crushing emptiness. The second thumbnail was a close-up. Skin bruised. A dark, ugly purple mark blooming across her ribcage. The third, David slammed his hand down on the keyboard, blindly mashing the escape key, Alt F4, anything to kill the window. The software, sluggish from the failing drive, froze. The images hung there, glaringly bright, massive, on the 32-inch display. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, a frantic, heavy drumming. The smell of sandalwood suddenly felt suffocating. He had just seen the billionaire ice queen of Chicago, stripped down to nothing, exposing not just her flesh, but a bruised, brutalized vulnerability that felt entirely illegal to witness. I'm dead, David thought. I'm fired. I'm blacklisted. Sam is going to lose his insurance. He slowly, mechanically turned his head. Clara Harrington was still sitting in her chair. She hadn't lunged for the keyboard. She hadn't screamed. She was staring at the screen, her face a pale, unreadable mask. Then she looked at him. The silence in the room stretched until it felt like a physical weight pressing against David's chest. He couldn't formulate a word. I'm sorry. Felt pathetic. I didn't mean to. Felt like a lie, even though it was true. She stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate. She walked over to the heavy oak door leading to the hallway. Click. She locked it. David's stomach dropped into his shoes. He looked from the door back to the monitor, where the bruised, naked image of the woman in front of him remained frozen on the screen. Clara walked back. She didn't return to her chair. She stepped directly into David's personal space. She was shorter than him, even in heels, but she suddenly felt 10 feet tall. She looked up, her dark eyes locking onto his. The bloodshot veins were stark against the white. She didn't look angry. She looked curious, fractured. Do you think I'm pretty, David? The question hit him like a physical blow. It was so completely disconnected from the reality of the situation that David thought he might have misheard her over the sound of his own rushing blood. Ms. Harrington. He started, his voice cracking like a teenager's. He swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. Clara, she interrupted. Her voice was flat, but there was a tremor underneath it, a vibration like a wire pulled too tight. Look at the screen, David. He didn't want to. His instincts, the instincts of a low-level employee trying to survive a corporate meat grinder, the instincts of a father who couldn't afford to be unemployed, screamed at him to stare at the floor. But her gaze was a physical force. He forced his eyes back to the monitor. The third thumbnail. The harsh lighting illuminated the pale skin of her thigh, scarred with a faint, jagged line. The woman on the screen looked hollowed out, a ghost haunting her own body. They were sent to me this morning, Clara said softly. She stood close enough that David could feel the heat radiating from her. From an anonymous server, with a price tag attached. Extortion. Blackmail. The pieces snapped into place in David's mind, cutting through the panic with cold logic. The bruised ribs, the desolate stare. These weren't nudes. They were evidence. Evidence of what he didn't know, but someone was weaponizing her pain. I need to shut the computer down, David said, his hands shaking slightly. He reached for the power button on the tower. Her hand shot out, her fingers wrapping around his wrist. Her grip was startlingly strong, her nails digging into his skin. I asked you a question, she whispered. David looked down at her. The corporate armor was entirely gone. Her lip was trembling. This wasn't a CEO interrogating an employee. This was a human being standing on the very edge of a cliff, asking a stranger to tell her if she was worth saving. He could lie. He could give her the polite, terrified answer. "Yes, Miss Harrington, of course you're beautiful. Please don't fire me." But the smell of stale coffee and ozone clung to him, a reminder of who he was. He was just a guy, a tired, broke guy who fixed broken things, and the thing standing in front of him was profoundly, fundamentally broken. "No," David said. The word hung in the air. Heavy. Final. Clara flinched her grip on his wrist, loosening for a fraction of a second before tightening again. Her eyes widened, a flash of genuine hurt, cutting through the numb exterior. "In those pictures," David continued, his voice steadying. He turned to face her, fully ignoring the screen. "No, you don't look pretty. You look terrified. You look like you're dying from the inside out. You look like someone beat the hell out of you physically and mentally and left you in a cold room." He pulled his wrist gently from her grasp. She let him go, her arm falling limply to her side. "Pretty is for magazines," David said, the cynicism he usually kept buried, bubbling up. "Pretty is the suit you're wearing and the desk you sit behind. That," he pointed at the monitor without looking at it, "is a crime scene." Clara stared at him. The silence stretched again, but the texture of it had changed. It was no longer suffocating. It felt fragile, like glass about to shatter. She took a step back, her knees hitting the edge of her desk. She sank down onto the floor. Not the chair, the floor. The billionaire CEO of Harrington Industries sat on the thick carpet, pulling her knees to her chest, exactly like the woman in the first photograph. He said no one would ever see them. She whispered, her voice finally breaking. The first tear spilled over, cutting a clean line through the smudge of makeup. He said if I left him, he would burn my life down. I left him 3 years ago. I thought I won. David stood there, his hands hanging uselessly by his sides. He knew about broken marriages. His own had ended with screaming matches and thrown plates, but never blackmail. Never bruises. "Who is he?" David asked. "My ex-husband," she choked out, burying her face in her arms. "Richard. He wants 50 million, or they go to the board, the press, everywhere." David looked at the screen again. He wasn't a hero. He didn't know how to fight billionaires or stop blackmailers. He knew how to fix servers. He knew how to run data recovery. He looked at the terminal window lingering behind the image viewer. He noticed something he had missed in his initial panic. The files weren't just sitting in a folder. The recovery tool had pulled the metadata. He squinted at the grey text hovering in the background. IP addresses. Routing history. The file hadn't just been downloaded. The temporary cache showed a direct active link to an external server used to verify the drop. "Ms. Harrington." David said, his voice dropping into the clinical detached tone he used when explaining a catastrophic server failure to a client. She didn't look up. David knelt down on the carpet next to her. He didn't touch her, but he made sure he was at her eye level. "Clara, look at me." She raised her head slowly. Her face was streaked with tears, her eyes hollow. "I can't tell you if you're pretty," David said, the rough texture of his voice contrasting with the soft rain outside. "And I don't have $50 million, but I know how computer networks work." He pointed to the screen. "Whoever sent this didn't just send an email. They established a remote handshake to verify you opened it. They left a door open. A very small, very stupid door." Clara wiped her eyes, her brow furrowing in confusion. "What does that mean?" David stood up, moving back to the keyboard. The fear of being fired was gone. The panic of seeing the photos was replaced by a cold, familiar anger. He hated bullies. He hated people who broke things and thought they could get away with it. It means, David said, his fingers resting on the mechanical keys, if you let me keep this door open for another 10 minutes, I can trace it back to the MAC address of the physical machine he used. I can find exactly where Richard is right now. Clara Harrington looked up at the tired, badly dressed IT guy in her office, the man who had just seen her stripped of all her power and hadn't lied to her. "Do it," she said. David's fingers hovered over the keyboard for a fraction of a second. The plastic keys were slightly greasy from his own sweat. He was about to cross a line. Fixing a broken registry was IT. Running a reverse trace on a live hostile connection was corporate espionage, or a felony. He wasn't entirely sure of the legal distinction, and frankly, looking at the tear-streaked face of the woman sitting on the floor, he didn't care. He pressed his hands down. The rhythmic, mechanical clatter of the keyboard filled the cavernous office, replacing the agonizing silence. He opened a new terminal window, pulling it over the image viewer, so he didn't have to look at the photographs anymore. The stark white text on the black background was comforting. It was a language he understood, perfectly devoid of cruelty or leverage. It was just math and pathways. "What are you doing?" Clara asked. Her voice was still thin, but the sheer panic had receded, replaced by a desperate, gripping focus. She pulled herself up from the floor, using the edge of the heavy desk for support, and stood a few feet behind him. When an amateur sends an email, they just attach a file and hit send, David said, his eyes scanning the cascading lines of data. When a professional does it, they don't send the file. They send a script disguised as a file. When you clicked it, it reached out to a server, downloaded the images into a temporary folder, and pinged the sender to say, "She's looking at them right now." He typed a command to isolate the active network connections, netstat-an. A list of IP addresses scrolled down the terminal. "He wanted to know the exact second you saw them," David muttered, leaning closer to the screen. The glare reflected off his smudged glasses. "It's a power trip. He wanted to feel it happen." Clara wrapped her arms around her chest. The charcoal suit looked too big for her suddenly, as if she had shrunk inside it. Richard always needed to be the smartest person in the room. He hates waiting. "Well, his impatience just gave us a thread to pull," David said. He found it. A single connection established on a non-standard port, quietly whispering back and forth across the network. It wasn't routing through a VPN or an encrypted proxy. It was raw, arrogant, and direct. "Gotcha!" David breathed. He didn't bother explaining the next steps to her. He didn't want to break his concentration. He opened a traceroute utility, feeding the hostile IP address into the command line. He watched the packets bounce from the 82nd floor down to the corporate servers in the basement, out into the Chicago fiber optic grid, and then they stopped. Not a dead end. A destination. The packets hit a residential broadband node located less than 3 miles away. David's brow furrowed. He ran a reverse DNS lookup on the node. The text materialized on the screen in a fraction of a second. Host customer -pool.gold coast.il.comcast.net. He's not hiding behind a server in Russia, David said, his voice tightening with disbelief. He's local. He's on a standard residential internet connection in the Gold Coast. Clara leaned over his shoulder. He could feel the warmth of her breath against his neck, smell the faint, bitter scent of the whiskey she had been drinking. "The Astor," she said, her voice dropping to a dead, hollow whisper. "It's a luxury condominium building. He kept the penthouse in the divorce settlement." David stopped typing. He let his hands fall to his lap. The adrenaline rush of the hunt faded, leaving a cold, heavy dread in his stomach. The blackmailer wasn't a faceless hacker. It was a billionaire sitting in a penthouse 20 minutes away, sipping a drink, waiting for his ex-wife to break. "David." He turned his head. She was staring at the side of his face. The vulnerability was still there, but the corporate titanium was beginning to reform over it, hardening her jawline. "Can you delete them?" she asked. "Can you get into his computer and wipe the files?" David barked a short, humorless laugh. He rubbed the back of his neck, the muscles tied into hard knots. "This isn't the movies, Clara. I can see his front door. I can't pick the lock, walk inside, and burn his filing cabinets. Not from here. If I try to force an entry through this connection, his router's firewall will log the attempt, block me, and alert him. He'll know we found him." Her shoulders slumped. The titanium cracked again. She closed her eyes, pressing 2 fingers hard against the bridge of her nose. "So we have nothing. We just know where the gun is pointed from." David looked back at the screen. He looked at the active connection, the digital thread connecting the traumatized woman behind him to the abuser in the penthouse. "We don't have nothing," David said slowly. An idea reckless and profoundly stupid began to form in the back of his mind. The connection goes both ways. He's monitoring this folder. If we just turn the computer off, the connection drops. He knows you panicked. He holds all the cards. He turned his chair to face her fully. The fluorescent lights from the terminal cast sharp shadows across his tired face. "But," David continued, lowering his voice, "if I write a script right now, I can flood that connection. I can send a massive, corrupted data packet back up the tunnel he opened. It won't delete his files, but it will crash the server he's using to host them. It will fry the local drive he's using to monitor you. It buys you time." Clara stared at him. The silence in the office was deafening, save for the relentless drumming of the rain against the glass. "How much time?" she asked. "Hours, maybe a day. Long enough for him to panic because his toy broke. Long enough for you to figure out your next move without a gun to your head." David checked his watch. It was 5:45 p.m. Meatloaf Night was dying a rapid death. Sam was probably sitting on the rug in front of the TV, waiting for the sound of the key in the apartment door. A sharp pang of guilt hit David's chest, a physical ache. He was risking his job, his freedom, and his son's stability for a woman who lived in a different universe, but he remembered the purple bruise on her ribs. He remembered his own ex-wife throwing a coffee mug that shattered against the wall, right next to Sam's crib. He remembered feeling entirely, humiliatingly powerless. "Do it," Clara said. It wasn't a command this time. It was a plea. The decision made the hesitation evaporated. David turned back to the keyboard, his posture shifting. He wasn't the tired IT guy anymore. He was a mechanic elbow-deep in an engine covered in grease, knowing exactly which valve to torque. "I need 5 minutes," he said, not looking at her. "Don't touch the desk. Don't touch the tower. Don't even breathe heavily near the cables. This drive is hanging by a thread." He opened a basic text editor. He didn't have access to sophisticated penetration testing tools down in the basement, let alone on a corrupted desktop terminal. He had to build the bomb from scratch, using basic shell commands. He started typing. The syntax flowed from his fingers' loops, variable declarations, null byte generators. He was writing a rudimentary fork bomb, tailored specifically to target the handshake protocol Richard's script was using. It was a dirty, brutal piece of code. It lacked elegance. Its only purpose was to hit the open door on Richard's end and multiply endlessly, overwhelming the destination processor until it choked and died. The air in the room felt impossibly still. Clara paced behind him. He could hear the soft shh, shh of her silk trousers brushing together the dull thud of her bare feet on the carpet. She had taken her heels off. The sound was intensely intimate, jarringly domestic in the sterile expanse of the corporate suite. David's cell phone buzzed in his pocket. A harsh, vibrating spasm against his thigh. He ignored it. He was deep in the logic of the code, nesting a loop that would disguise the flood of data as standard receipt acknowledgement packets. It buzzed again. And a third time. "Your phone," Clara said, stopping her pacing. "It can wait," David grunted, fixing a missing semicolon. "If it's an emergency." "It's not an emergency." David snapped, the stress finally bleeding into his voice. "It's my kid's babysitter. I'm late. Now please let me focus." The silence returned, but it felt heavier now. Awkward. David immediately regretted his tone. You didn't snap at the CEO, but the CEO didn't usually strip down to her soul in front of you on a Tuesday evening. "I'm sorry," Clara said softly. David paused his typing. He looked at the reflection of the room in the dark edge of the monitor. She was standing by the window, looking out at the glittering, wet city. She looked terribly small. "Don't be," David said, his fingers resuming their rhythm. "Sam's fine. Mrs. Higgins just charges by the hour. She gets antsy." "Sam, your son?" "Yeah, 7. Thinks he's a dinosaur." A faint, ghostly sound escaped Clara. It took David a second to realize it was a laugh. Short, bitter, but real. "Richard didn't want children," she said, her breath fogging the cold glass of the window. "He said they were depreciating assets. They took focus away from the portfolio." David felt a surge of disgust so profound it made his teeth ache. He hit the enter key harder than necessary, testing the first block of code. The terminal returned 0 errors. "Well," David said, his voice cold, "Richard sounds like a spreadsheet wrapped in human skin. Sam is a pain in the arse. He refuses to eat anything green, and he broke my TV last month with a plastic hammer. But he's not an asset. He's the only real thing in my life." He didn't know why he was telling her this. The exhaustion was stripping away his filters. "I have a lot of assets," Clara whispered, pressing her forehead against the glass. "And none of it is real. Not the company, not this office. It's all just leverage. Everything is leverage." "Almost done," David said, changing the subject before the atmosphere crushed them both. He couldn't fix her life. He could only fix the network. He compiled the script. He saved it directly to the root directory, bypassing the failing partition. He took a deep breath, the smell of ozone sharp in his nostrils. "Okay," David said. "This is going to be loud, digitally speaking. Once I execute this, his monitoring program is going to try to swallow a terabyte of garbage data in about 4 seconds. His machine will lock up. He won't be able to drop the connection or save anything that's currently in his active memory." Clara turned away from the window. She walked back to the desk, her bare feet silent on the carpet. She stood right beside his chair, looking down at the screen. "Will it hurt him?" she asked. The question was perfectly flat, devoid of malice, devoid of mercy. "It'll probably fry his motherboard, might start a small fire in his computer case if his cooling fans are cheap," David said, half joking. "Do it." David moved his mouse over the executable file. He didn't hesitate this time. He double-clicked. For 2 seconds, nothing happened. The terminal window blinked. The rain kept falling. Then the cooling fans inside Clara's desktop tower roared to life. It sounded like a jet engine spinning up for takeoff. The computer casing vibrated violently against David's knees. The processor was redlining, pushing massive amounts of data out through the network card. On the screen, the terminal window exploded into a blur of scrolling text moving too fast to read. Thousands of packets, millions of lines of garbage code, screaming across the fiber optic cables, aimed directly at the penthouse in the Gold Coast. "Come on," David muttered, gripping the edge of the desk. Choke on it. Choke on it. The lights in the office flickered. A localized power drain as the hardware pushed itself to the absolute breaking point. The smell of burning dust and hot metal filled the tight space beneath the desk. Then abruptly, the fans cut out. The terminal window froze. A single line of text appeared at the bottom of the screen. Connection reset by peer. Time out. David exhaled a long, shaky breath that felt like it had been trapped in his lungs for an hour. He reached down and held the physical power button on the tower. 5 seconds later, the machine powered off with a heavy click. The monitor went black. The silence rushed back into the room, absolute and heavy. "It's done," David said, leaning back in the chair. His shirt was clinging to his back, damp with cold sweat. "The door is closed. His machine is dead. He can't see you anymore." Clara didn't move. She just stared at the blank, black monitor. The reflection of her own face stared back at her, pale, exhausted, the makeup smeared beneath her eyes. The terrifying vulnerability of the photographs was gone, locked away inside the dead metal box beneath the desk. She slowly lowered herself into her leather chair. The leather creaked a harsh sound in the quiet room. She picked up her tumbler of whiskey. The ice had completely melted, watering down the amber liquid. She drank it anyway, draining the glass in one long, desperate swallow. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was raspy, the throat tightened by the burn of the alcohol. David began packing his tools. He shoved his screwdrivers and the diagnostic USB back into the stained canvas bag. The zipper snagged, and he fought with it for a second, feeling incredibly awkward. The adrenaline crash was hitting him hard. His hands were shaking. He was just a guy making $40,000 a year, and he had just executed a cyber attack against a billionaire. "I need to take the drive down to the shredder," David said, avoiding her gaze. "Protocol for corrupted local storage. I'll log it as a catastrophic mechanical failure. No one will ever know what was on it." "No," Clara said. David stopped, his hand resting on the canvas bag. He looked up. She was looking at him with a strange, intense clarity. The panic had burned away, leaving something hard and sharp in its place. "I don't want it shredded," she said. "I want it secured. I want it locked in a vault that only you and I know about." David frowned, the lines around his eyes deepening. "Clara, that drive is a live grenade. If Richard has copies—" "He has copies," she interrupted, her tone turning cold, purely analytical. It was the CIO talking now. "He's a paranoid narcissist. He has backups in a safe deposit box or on an encrypted cloud server. Frying his laptop didn't delete the photographs, David. It just bought me time." "Then why keep the drive?" "Because—" She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the petrified wood of the desk. "It contains the connection logs. It contains the forensic proof that he sent them to me. It proves the extortion." David ran a hand over his face. He felt entirely out of his depth. The water was rising and he didn't know how to swim. "Look, Ms. Harrington." Clara, I'm a hardware technician. I swap out dead monitors and reset forgotten passwords for the accounting department. I just committed a federal crime for you. I need to go home and make meatloaf for my kid." He stood up, grabbing the heavy canvas bag. The weight of it felt familiar, grounding. "I'll pull the drive." He continued, keeping his voice steady, despite the tremor in his chest. "I'll give it to you. You put it in your personal safe. But that's it. I'm out. I close the ticket, and we pretend this never happened." Clara watched him. She didn't look angry. She looked calculating. She reached into the top drawer of her desk and pulled out a slim leather-bound checkbook. She grabbed a heavy silver fountain pen. "How much do you make, David?" she asked, uncapping the pen. The question felt like a slap. It was so casually dismissive, reducing the terrifying intimacy of the last hour to a transaction. "It doesn't matter," David said, his jaw tightening. 50,000, 60. She didn't wait for an answer. She began writing. The scratching of the nib against the heavy paper was loud in the quiet room. "I'm writing a check for $250,000. It's a consulting fee for specialized off-hours security services." She ripped the check from the book and slid it across the smooth surface of the desk. It stopped near the edge right in front of where David stood. He looked at the number. A 2. A 5. 4 zeros. It was a house. It was college tuition for Sam. It was the end of the crushing, suffocating anxiety that woke him up at 3 a.m. every single night, calculating rent and grocery bills in the dark. It was freedom, and it made him sick to his stomach. David didn't touch it. He looked from the piece of paper up to Clara's eyes. "I don't want your money," he said. His voice was quiet, completely devoid of the deference he had shown her when he walked into the room an hour ago. Clara's hand hovered over the desk. She looked genuinely confused. "Don't be proud, David. You need it. You said yourself you're worried about your son." "I am," David said, stepping closer to the desk. He leaned over, planting his hands on the wood, bringing his face closer to hers. He smelled the whiskey, the sandalwood, and the sharp scent of fear she was trying so hard to hide. "But taking that check makes me your employee," David said, his voice a low gravel. "It makes me a hired gun. It means when the police look at this, and they will look at this when you go to war with Richard, they'll see a bribe. They'll see a broke AT guy paid off by a billionaire to manufacture a cyber attack against her ex-husband." Clara flinched. She hadn't thought of that. She was used to money solving the immediate problem, erasing the friction of reality. "I'm not going to jail for you, Clara. Sam needs me here, not in a federal penitentiary." He pushed himself back from the desk. He knelt down, pulled his screwdriver from the bag, and quickly, brutally unscrewed the mounting bracket, holding the hard drive in place. He ripped the SATA cable out, freeing the rectangular metal brick from the tower. He stood up and dropped the drive directly onto the $250,000 check. The heavy metal smacked against the desk. "Put it in your safe," David said. He slung the bag over his shoulder. He turned and walked toward the locked door. He unlocked it, the heavy metal bolt sliding back with a solid clunk. He opened the door, the cold, sterile air of the 82nd floor hallway, rushing in, smelling of floor wax and silence. "David." He stopped in the doorway. He didn't turn around. "What do I do now?" she asked. The CEO was gone again. It was just the woman on the screen, terrified, and alone asking a stranger for a map out of hell. David closed his eyes for a second. He was so tired. "You stop letting him hold the gun," David said, looking out at the empty hallway. "He wants 50 million. He wants you to bleed. You don't pay him. You don't negotiate." He finally turned his head, looking back at her. She was standing behind the desk, holding the hard drive tightly against her chest like a shield. "You let him burn his own life down," David said. "I'll see you tomorrow, Ms. Harrington." He walked out, pulling the door shut behind him. Gravity hit him the moment the private elevator door slid shut, pulling him down 82 floors in a stomach-churning drop. The pressure squeezed his eardrums, but he didn't swallow to pop them. The dull, muted throb in his head matched the heavy, rhythmic thud of his own heart. He stepped out into the lobby. It was a cathedral of marble and polished steel, indifferent to the people moving through it. The security guard at the front desk, a guy named Mike, who always smelled faintly of peppermint and stale tobacco, gave him a standard nod. David nodded back. He pushed through the heavy revolving doors and out into the Chicago night. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a biting wind that whipped off Lake Michigan, carrying the smell of wet asphalt and exhaust fumes. David pulled his collar up, shivering, as the damp chill bit through his cheap wool coat. He walked the 3 blocks to the Red Line station, his boots splashing through shallow puddles, reflecting the neon glow of streetlights. He had left $250,000 on a desk. The thought looped in his mind, relentless and mocking. 250,000. It wasn't a number. It was a completely different life. It was a house in the suburbs with a backyard where Sam could leave his plastic dinosaurs in the grass. It was a refrigerator that didn't hum with a dying rattle. It was the absolute cessation of the low-grade buzzing panic that had lived at the base of his skull since his divorce. He swiped his transit card at the turnstile. It beeped a warning low balance. $17 left. David descended the concrete stairs into the subterranean heat of the station. It smelled like hot dust rust and the metallic tang of electrified rails. He stood on the edge of the platform, staring down at the trash scattered between the tracks. A crumpled fast food wrapper, a single muddy sneaker. He thought about the check again. The thick paper, the heavy black ink from the fountain pen. He closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the cold tile of the pillar behind him. He wasn't a hero. He was an idiot. A proud, stupid, broke idiot who let a misguided sense of working-class morality get in the way of his son's future. The train roared into the station, a shrieking mass of metal and yellow light. The noise was deafening, physical, shaking the concrete beneath his feet. He boarded the train, grabbing onto a metal overhead bar. The car was mostly empty, smelling faintly of old coffee and wet dog. As the train lurched forward, swaying violently on the aging tracks, David looked at his reflection in the dark window opposite him. He looked grey, exhausted. The lines around his mouth seemed to have carved themselves a millimeter deeper in the last 2 hours. If I took the money, he thought I wouldn't be David the IT guy anymore. I'd be David the accomplice. He had seen what happened to people who lived in Clara Harrington's world. They treated money like gravity, using it to bend the rules, to pull people into their orbit and crush them when they were no longer useful. Richard had used money to isolate her. Clara had instinctively tried to use money to buy David's silence and complicity. If he took it, he was confirming that everything had a price. That he had a price. By the time he unlocked the door to his apartment, it was past 7. The hallway smelled like boiled cabbage from Mrs. Higgins's apartment next door. "You're late," she said, before he even had his coat off. She was sitting on his worn beige sofa, a thick cardigan wrapped around her narrow shoulders, a tabloid magazine resting on her lap. "I know. I'm sorry, Helen. Server crash." David lied smoothly. The lie tasted like ash. Sam is in his room. He wouldn't eat the carrots. She stood up, her joints popping audibly. David pulled his wallet from his back pocket. He handed her a crumpled 20 and a 10. "Thanks for staying." She pocketed the cash with a curt nod and shuffled out the door, the deadbolt clicking heavily behind her. David dropped his canvas tool bag by the door. The apartment was quiet, save for the hum of the dying refrigerator. He walked into the tiny kitchen. The Formica countertops were chipped, the linoleum floor peeling in the corner. He opened the fridge. A plastic container of leftover meatloaf sat next to a half-empty carton of milk. He heated the meatloaf in the microwave, watching the orange digital numbers count down. The smell of cheap tomato sauce filled the kitchen aggressively ordinary. He carried the plate into the living room and pushed open Sam's bedroom door. The floor was a minefield of Legos and action figures. Sam was sitting on his bed, wearing a faded green dinosaur onesie, entirely absorbed in a comic book. "Hey, T-Rex," David said softly. Sam looked up. His face, so much like his mother's, lit up. "Dad, did you fix the computers?" "I fixed one," David said, sitting on the edge of the narrow mattress. The springs groaned under his weight. He handed Sam a fork. "Eat your meatloaf. Helen said you boycotted the carrots." "Carrots are for herbivores," Sam declared, stabbing a piece of meat. "I'm a carnivore." "Right, my mistake." David watched his son eat. He watched the way Sam's small hand gripped the plastic handle of the fork. He looked at the frayed cuffs of the dinosaur onesie. He felt a sudden fierce tightening in his chest, a wave of protective rage so strong it made his vision blur. He had walked away from $250,000. But sitting here listening to his kid chew on dry meatloaf, he knew he had made the only choice he could survive. He hadn't brought the corruption of the 82nd floor into this room. He hadn't brought Richard's sickness or Clara's desperate leverage into his home. He was broke, but he was clean. "Dad?" Sam asked, looking at him with wide, observant eyes. "Are you sad?" David blinked, forcing a tired smile. He reached out and ruffled Sam's hair. "No, buddy. Just a long day dealing with a really broken machine." Wednesday morning tasted like copper and old coffee. David sat at his workbench in the basement tea department. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their angry, hornet-like tune. The air was thick with the smell of hot, soldering iron and dust. In front of him lay the gutted remains of 3 motherboards from the accounting department, a tangle of green silicon and silver capacitors. He was waiting to be fired. He had spent the entire morning watching the heavy metal fire door at the end of the hall. Every time the handle turned, his stomach seized. He expected security. 2 large men in cheap suits coming to confiscate his badge and escort him out of the building. You didn't walk out on the CEO refuse her money, tell her she was handling her blackmail poorly, and expect to keep your dental plan. It was 11:30 a.m. He picked up a multimeter, pressing the metal prongs against a resistor, trying to focus on the digital readout. The numbers blurred. His hands were shaking slightly. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the image of Clara sitting on the floor. The stark, brutalized geometry of her bruised ribs glowing on the monitor. The heavy fire door groaned open. David's hand slipped. The multimeter beeped a sharp error code. He put the tool down, wiping his palms on his jeans, and looked up. It wasn't security. Clara Harrington walked into the basement. The IT department suddenly felt completely absurd, like someone had dropped a sleek, predatory shark into a muddy puddle. She was wearing a tailored navy blue suit today, the fabric cutting a sharp, uncompromising silhouette. Her hair was pulled back into that terrifying, immaculate knot at the base of her skull. The armor was back on, completely impenetrable. Except she was holding 2 paper cups from the high-end artisan coffee shop across the street. The handful of other technicians in the room, a guy named Gary, who lived on energy drinks, and a quiet kid named Linus, froze. They stared at the billionaire CEO, walking past racks of humming servers, as if a ghost had just drifted through the concrete walls. Clara ignored them. She walked straight to David's workbench, her heels clicking a sharp, authoritative rhythm on the scuffed linoleum floor. She stopped in front of him. She didn't say anything at first. She just looked at the messy array of wires, tools, and broken hardware scattered across his anti-static mat. She set one of the paper cups down on a clean patch of the desk. "Black. No sugar," she said. Her voice was crisp. The raspy vulnerability from the night before was entirely gone. "Thanks," David said cautiously. He didn't touch the cup. He remained seated on his stool, looking up at her. He felt hyper-aware of the grease stain on the elbow of his flannel shirt. "Margaret said you had 3 dead motherboards to fix. Clara said, glancing at the pile of silicon. "Did you salvage them?" "2 of them. The third has a burnt Northbridge chip. It's garbage." "Like Richard's computer." David tensed. He glanced quickly over his shoulder. Gary and Linus were aggressively pretending to look at their monitors, but their posture was rigid. "We should probably take a walk," David said, keeping his voice low. "We don't need to walk," Clara replied, pulling a tall, wobbly metal stool from the adjacent empty desk. She sat down next to him. She crossed her legs, resting her hands on her knee. She looked entirely out of place, yet completely in control. "I didn't pay him," she said. The words hung in the dusty air between them. David felt a sudden sharp exhalation of breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Okay. I took your advice," she continued, her dark eyes locking on to his. There was no warmth in her gaze, but there was a crystalline focus. "I didn't negotiate with the gun. I used the hard drive you ripped out of my machine." "Clara, I told you, taking that drive to the police." "I didn't take it to the police," she interrupted smoothly. "The police are slow. They leak information. They care about procedure. I don't care about procedure. I care about leverage." She took a sip of her coffee. "At 3 a.m. last night, I had my personal security chief hand-deliver the hard drive to a private intelligence firm in D.C. They extracted the connection logs, the MAC addresses, the time-stamped ping requests from Richard's penthouse." David stared at her. "You hired mercenaries." "I hired specialists," she corrected. By 8 a.m., they had traced the origin of his blackmail script back through his personal router. But they didn't stop there. Since his firewall was down, thanks to the garbage data flood you sent him, they walked right through his open ports. They mapped his entire local network while his machine was choking. David felt a cold sweat prickle at his hairline. What he had done was a misdemeanor in the grand scheme of things. What she had authorized was a massive, aggressive cyber intrusion. "They found the photos," she said softly. For a fraction of a second, the armor cracked just a hairline fracture around her mouth. Then it sealed up again. "They deleted them. They wiped his primary storage arrays. But more importantly, they found his offshore banking ledgers, the ones he hid during the divorce." David leaned back on his stool. The sheer scale of the retaliation made his head spin. "You robbed him." "I secured collateral," she said firmly. "I had my lawyers draft a new settlement agreement. I sent it to him an hour ago. He has 24 hours to sign over his remaining shares in Harrington Industries and permanently relocate to his property in Switzerland. If he refuses, or if a single copy of those photos ever surfaces, I turn his banking ledgers over to the IRS and the connection logs to the FBI for cyber stalking and felony extortion." "Mutual assured destruction," David whispered. "No," Clara said, her voice dropping to a dangerous low hum. "Just his destruction. I have the high ground now. He thought I would break because I was ashamed of the bruises. He was wrong. I'm not ashamed anymore. I'm just angry." David looked at the woman sitting next to him. He remembered the broken ghost on his monitor 12 hours ago. The transformation was terrifying and profoundly impressive. She hadn't healed. She had just weaponized her trauma. "Why are you down here, Clara?" David asked, the cynicism bleeding back into his voice. "You won. You burned him to the ground. You don't need the IT guy anymore." She looked down at the paper cup in her hands. For the first time since she walked in, she looked slightly uncertain. "I came down here," she said slowly, "because you left the check on the desk." The buzzing of the fluorescent lights seemed louder suddenly. David crossed his arms, leaning against the edge of his workbench. The smell of the soldering iron was harsh in his throat. "I told you why I didn't take the money," David said. I'm not a hired gun." "I know," Clara said. She looked around the basement, her eyes taking in the scuffed floors, the chaotic piles of cables, the water stains on the drop-ceiling tiles. "You're a man who works in a basement, who is drowning in debt, who has a child to support, and who looked at $250,000 and walked away because it didn't feel clean." She turned back to him. "In my world, David, everyone has a price. Every board member, every lawyer, every vice president on the top floor. They all smile at me, and they all have a number in their head that would make them betray me. Richard knew that. That's why he thought money and leverage would break me." She leaned closer. The scent of cedarwood and citrus cut through the ozone of the IT department. "You are the only person I have interacted with in 5 years who didn't want something from me. You saw me completely destroyed, and you didn't lie to me. You didn't take advantage of me. You just fixed the broken thing, told me the truth, and went home to your son." David didn't know what to say. He looked at his hands, calloused and stained with thermal grease. "So," Clara continued her tone, shifting back to the crisp executive cadence. She reached into the inside pocket of her tailored jacket and pulled out a thick manila folder. She set it on the anti-static mat right on top of the burnt motherboard. "What is that?" David asked, eyeing the folder like it might bite him. "That is a contract," she said. David frowned. "I told you I don't want your money. It's not a payoff, it's an employment contract." Clara tapped the thick cardstock with her index finger. "The intelligence firm in D.C. found massive holes in our corporate firewall while they were tracking Richard. This company's internal security is a joke. We are vulnerable to external breaches, ransomware, and apparently domestic extortion scripts." She stood up, smoothing the front of her jacket. "I am restructuring the IT department. As of this morning, Gary and Linus report to Margaret. You no longer fix broken motherboards for accounting." David stared at the folder. He didn't touch it. "What do I do then?" "You are the new director of information security for Harrington Industries," Clara said. "Your salary is $160,000 a year, fully salaried on the books, fully taxed. You get comprehensive health vision and dental insurance." She paused, looking directly into his eyes. "Which I believe covers pediatric braces." David's breath caught in his chest. He felt a sudden dizzying rush of adrenaline. 160,000. It wasn't the sudden lottery win of the $250,000 check. It was a career. It was a lifeline that didn't feel like a bribe. It felt like respect. "I'm a hardware tech, Clara," David said, his voice rough. "I don't have a degree in cybersecurity. You reverse-engineered a hostile network intrusion on a failing hard drive in under 10 minutes using a basic shell terminal," she countered smoothly. "I don't care about degrees. I care about instinct. I need someone guarding my network who knows how to spot a bully and who isn't afraid to punch them in the mouth digitally." David looked at the folder. Then he looked up at her. The towering billionaire CEO who had cried on her office floor. The woman who had just scorched the earth to protect herself. "There are conditions," David said slowly. Clara raised an eyebrow. "You're negotiating brave. I leave at 5 p.m. David stated, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "No exceptions unless the building is physically on fire. Tuesdays are meatloaf nights. I pick my kid up from the babysitter. I don't miss dinner. I won't be on call for your personal emergencies at midnight. I work for the company, not for you." Clara stared at him for a long, silent moment. The hum of the servers filled the void. Slowly the corners of her mouth twitched upwards. It wasn't a full smile, but it was genuine. It reached her eyes. 5 p.m., she agreed. "And I handle my own personal emergencies from now on." She turned and walked toward the heavy fire door. She paused with her hand on the metal handle, looking back over her shoulder at the tired IT guy in the flannel shirt. "Drink your coffee, David. Read the contract. I expect you on the 80th floor tomorrow morning. It smells better up there anyway." She pushed the door open and disappeared into the hallway. David sat on his stool for a long time. The coffee in the paper cup was still hot. He picked it up and took a sip. It was bitter strong and entirely unfamiliar. He reached out and pulled the manila folder toward him. He opened it, looking at the crisp, legally binding pages inside. There was no hidden agenda, no blackmail, just a job description, a salary, and a line for his signature. He looked at the dead, burnt motherboard sitting next to the contract. He had spent his whole life fixing broken things, putting pieces back together, expecting them to inevitably break again. But looking at the paper in front of him, he realized something profound. Sometimes when a thing breaks, you don't just put it back exactly the way it was. Sometimes the trauma of the break forces you to rebuild it stronger. You reinforce the weak points. You rewrite the code. Clara Harrington had rebuilt herself overnight. And in the process, she had given him the tools to rebuild his own life. David picked up a cheap blue ballpoint pen from his desk. He rolled it between his fingers, feeling the familiar plastic texture. He thought about the Red Line train. He thought about the $17 on his transit card. He thought about Sam asleep in the green dinosaur onesie, dreaming of a world where he was the apex predator. David pressed the pen to the paper, the ink flowing smoothly across the dotted line. He signed his name. The scratching sound of the pen was quiet, steady, and full of quiet gravity. He wasn't flying into the sun like Icarus. He was just a man stepping out of the basement, finally finding his footing on solid ground. He capped the pen, closed the folder, and looked at the clock on the wall. It was 11:45 a.m. He had plenty of time to get some real food for dinner. Sam was going to eat his vegetables tonight, whether the kid liked it or not. If David's raw, uncompromising choice resonated with you, you're not alone. We all face moments where integrity clashes with desperation, where doing the right thing feels like the hardest path possible. David and Clara didn't find a fairy tale. They found mutual respect in the trenches of reality. If you loved this deep dive into corporate shadows and human resilience, hit that like button to support the channel. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that real strength isn't about armor. It's about how you rebuild after you break. Subscribe for more grounded, hard-hitting storytelling. See you next time.